Hello, my name is Carmen Santi. I'm the FENS President and Chair of the ALBA Network. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this panel discussion on how to negotiate to get what you need. This panel is organized by two networks that are very active in the topics of inclusion. The ALBA Network that supports diversity and equity in sciences, and the FENS. My name is Carmen Santi. We have a wonderful lineup of discussions. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the panel moderators. Selka Aksunik from the Zagreb University, a member of the ALBA Board of Directors, and Inbal Goshen from the Hebrew University and scholar of the FKNE. Enjoy the panel, and let's now welcome Selka.
Hello, I would like to thank you all for joining us here today, and welcome you to our live event on negotiation skills in academia. The name of the panel is How to Negotiate to Get What You Need. And this panel is organized by ALBA Network and FENS Network of Excellence. And I'm pleased to say that ALBA Network is represented by Marianne Joels, Aparna Suvratan, Meno Vitter, and FENS Network of Excellence is represented by Laura Andre, Johannes Graf, and Megan Carey. They will tell us their principles for negotiations with some real-life examples. And importantly, last 15 minutes, all of you will be able to ask questions through a chat system. Now, let me start with our first panelist and my co-chair, Megan Carey. Megan is a group leader at the Champollion Center for the Unknown in Lisbon, in Portugal. And she has an extensive experience not only in research, but in a variety of scientific activities, such as ALBA Network Board of Directors. Megan, can you please share with us what are your major principles for negotiations you used throughout your career?
Sure. Thank you, Zelka. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not sure I have any sort of systematic principles that I can say that I use for negotiation, but I can say that I think negotiation is one of the hardest things that we do in our professional careers. And I think for me, what makes it really difficult is that it should be simple because it's just about trying to communicate what you need. But communicating what you need requires you to first identify what you need. And I think you also have to really believe that you deserve it. And that can be really hard because it gets tied up in your own feelings of self-worth. And if you have imposter syndrome, which is something that I've struggled with for a lot of my career, it can be really hard to even convince yourself that you deserve or need the things that you're asking for. And if you can't convince yourself, then it's certainly going to be difficult to convince somebody else. So my advice and some of the strategies I use are basically, I try not to make it be about me. And I think that that's something that people can do in general. So when you recognize that you're asking for what you need, it isn't necessarily you that needs the thing. You're asking, often we're asking for, things that we need to do our experiments, right? Your research plan needs these things. Your trainees need the space and the resources to do the experiments that they need in order to succeed. And so, and even for salary and things, it's often not what you personally need, but what you need in order to provide for your family as well. So for me, it's been useful to frame identifying my own needs that way. And then in terms of trying to convince myself of whether or not I actually deserve the things that I'm asking for, I learned when I was a postdoc, when I was applying for postdoc fellowships, I was having a really hard time writing the personal statement sections, which are the ones where you sort of have to say all the great things that you've done in your career and why you're a good person to receive the awards. And what I started doing was working with peers, friends of mine actually, and I would read their CVs and they would read my CVs, and then I'd look at what they'd written for their personal statement, and I found it was really easy for me to identify the great things about my colleagues, and it was easy for them to identify my strengths, but it was much harder for each of us to do this individually. So I think pairing up with a buddy can be a really useful strategy because that other person can help you recognize the things about your career that may be harder for you to see. And then for me, that's how I started, and then I eventually got to the point where I could read my own CV, and I still do this actually sometimes. I look at my own CV and I read it, and I think, and pretending like it's someone else's. And then I think, hey, you know, that Dr. Carey isn't so bad. And when I'm doing that, it really helps me detach and depersonalize. And then I can see my own strengths and also my weaknesses sometimes much more objectively. And so I think it's sort of a depersonalization, both on the side of thinking about what you need that it isn't for you, but also depersonalization on the side of assessing your own worth and your own strengths and achievements. So that's what I recommend. Zelka, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was very inspiring. I actually made some notes for future for myself. Okay, our next panelist is Aparna Subratan from McGill University. And Aparna is an assistant professor at the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery and Pediatrics. And she's a junior scientist at the Research Institute of the McGill University Health Center. So Aparna, in your opinion, what are the tools needed to be assertive, not pushy, during negotiations? And can you please give us some tips, especially useful at the early stage in a scientist's career?
Thank you for that, Shaka. It's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. Of course, it would have been wonderful to meet all of you in person in Glasgow, but I'm glad we could do this at a distance nevertheless. So I have tried to distill down what I think about negotiation and how one can proceed most effectively based on my own experience into about 4 discussion points. And so the first one I'd like to mention is that I feel the burden should be to try and persuade the other person why what you want is in their best interests as well. Now, it's clear you want something, but why should they want the same thing? What is the benefit for them? So I feel if one can find that point, it already helps bring people towards a consensus on a negotiation. So I really feel this discussion is perhaps my first principle for negotiation. My second one is really that you should know exactly what you want. If you are vague about what you want, you're not going to get it, especially if the person you're negotiating with knows really well what they're willing to offer. So, so I think you should have it laid out. You should know what you're willing to settle for, the things that are important to you, the things that are less important to you. And this is a very personal decision, right? Because you can be like, oh, if you're negotiating for a new job as a junior faculty, for example, perhaps it's absolutely critical that you get, I don't know, funding support for one person in your lab, whereas maybe you feel that the salary structure in that university is pretty equitable, you don't really need to negotiate, right? So you really have to know what you want to negotiate for. So really have a plan. And so it's helpful to have a long-term plan and a short-term plan and know this is what I need right now. I really need to ask for this, otherwise I will not, get to the first step in my short-term plan. So that's point 2. So point 3 is really ties in a little bit to what Megan already mentioned, but in perhaps with a slightly different angle, which is talk to other people. But in this case, talk to other people who've been through similar negotiations, who know something about the system, because often one goes into a negotiation which is in a context that one knows nothing about. After all, the very first time you start applying for faculty positions or even for postdoc positions, you've never done this before. And the situation is often quite specific to each place. Right? So what might be reasonable in one context to ask for or to negotiate about is completely unreasonable in another context. So it really helps to talk to somebody who's been through a similar kind of negotiation, get their advice, get their experiences. What did they regret not asking for or not negotiating for? Conversely, perhaps what did they regret negotiating for that was unreasonable in that context, maybe. So it's so helpful to know the situation you're going into that is novel to you. if you can manage to talk to people who've been through that, that's a resource like no other, and that's super valuable. And the final thing that I'd like to mention is, again, this happens to all of us, we're human, which is try not to carry the baggage of previous experiences, especially as negative emotion. You know, perhaps you've had a negotiation that didn't work in some context. You're bitter about it. Don't carry defensiveness and go to the next negotiation. Learn from your experiences, see what you could have done better, or perhaps it just was a difficult situation, but try not to go into your next negotiation with all the baggage of that previous one. Start with a fresh slate. And so I think that's sort of perhaps the 4 points that I could think of that have been helpful to me. Try to convince the other person that what you want is what they want. Know exactly what you want and why you want it and what you're willing to settle for. Have a plan, you know. Consult with people who know more than you do. Consult with people who've been through the same thing, or who know that system, perhaps senior colleagues in the institute you're applying for. And perhaps don't carry over one negotiation into another. That's it from me.
Great, thank you, Aparna, so much. You are a young PI, and I know you have many PhD students, right?
I have a couple, yeah.
Do you think they need to learn how to negotiate, or is it, did they already try to negotiate with you, and did it work?
I believe actually in a lab environment, one does negotiate for smaller things. One doesn't consciously think of them as negotiation. When we discuss negotiation, we sort of think of the big things, job negotiation and such. But honestly, there's a little bit of negotiation happening every single day, and developing an equation with your graduate student for a long term. I think that initial phase is about understanding how each of us negotiate. You know, it's as small as saying somebody being keen on doing experiment 1 and the PI being like, I think experiment 2 is more critical right now. And there's a little bit of negotiation happening there. Sure, I think 1 is a great idea, but perhaps you want to begin with 2 because, right? So there's always small level negotiation going on in the lab. And I think we have a great equation. So I think so far we've all been happy with our negotiations.
Great, thank you so much. I completely agree with you. Megan?
So I think I should probably say Carmen had introduced that Zelka and Inbal Goshen would be co-chairing the session, but Inbal wasn't able to be here, so I'm stepping in as co-moderator. So I'd next like to turn to Johannes Graf from EPFL. Johannes is a PI there, and I was wondering if you could give us some real-life examples for successful negotiations, Johannes.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Megan, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So I would like to give you 2 examples that span a little bit my career. And the first was when I was an undergrad student, and the other one when I was a postdoc and trying to get into a faculty position. So as an undergrad student, I had this yearning to do an exchange year. And in order to prepare for an exchange year, actually to be spent in Vancouver, I was seeking advice from different people, from different PIs in our institute and our university. And one person I wanted to get the advice from is a certain Jacques Dubochet, who later turned out to be the 2017 Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. And of course, back then he wasn't the Nobel Prize winner, but he was still quite famous. He happened to be the head of the department, but unfortunately he was in sabbatical. So I was like, well, how do I do this? He wouldn't be replying to my emails. So I sent him emails, he wouldn't be replying. And then one day I see him walking by the cafeteria. So I literally ran after him and said, Monsieur Dubochet, can I have 5 minutes of your time? And he was like, no, I'm on sabbatical, and just kept on walking. I was like, so what do you do? So I ran after him a second time. And he said, look, I told you I'm on sabbatical. And I said, look, yes, but I mean, you're here, I'm here, can't we just talk? And he was like, all right, okay, why don't you come for 5 minutes? And so we went to his office and we started talking, and he gave me some advice. And at the end, he also said, and by the way, couldn't you also use a letter of recommendation? I'm like, well, sure. I mean, I wasn't even thinking about this. But so he ended up giving me a letter of recommendation. And he even recommended me, you know, you like hiking, because Canada is great for hiking. So you should also be doing some hiking besides your studies. And yeah, so I ended up going to Canada, probably also thanks to his letter of recommendation. And I wouldn't know how I would have turned out, you know, how my life would have turned out without this exchange here. And without the kind of tenacity, I think that's what I want to get at, without the tenacity of running after him for a second time. So that's the first example. And the second example was when I was a postdoc at MIT. I happened to be interested in going back to Switzerland for my for a PI position, and there was an event at the Swiss consulate, and representatives from EPFL were there. And so I started to talk to one person there, and I said, look, you know, we have this really cool paper coming out, and would you think that this is good enough for EPFL or so? And he was like, yeah, sure. So where's the paper going to be published? And I said, well, it's in Nature. Okay, good. But what else? What else do you have? And I'm like, wow, really? You know, they're not happy with one big paper. You need to have more. And so for a moment, I was like, okay, well, I guess let's forget about EPFL. And I start to look for something else. But then I'm like, well, look, listen, I still want to try. And so I did. And of course, you know, Carmen was the head of the institute at the time, and I got in touch with Carmen, and she was very supportive, and I ended up being at EPFL. But it's also, it's again a second example of not giving up too quickly, I would say, because if I hadn't, then you know, I wouldn't be at EPFL now. And I think the gist of it, or the summary of it, is that if you don't try, you will to negotiate, or if you don't try to insist a little bit, you'll never find out. And so these are the two examples that I wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Johannes. I wonder, were you conscious of the fact that you were engaging in a negotiation in those instances, would you say?
I think not going, so not running after Dubochet, and not in that very moment before. But as I was talking to him, yes, it dawned upon me that this is kind of an important moment. You know, it's like, it can go both ways. So it can be a definite no, or it can, you know, the negotiation can go on. And those moments are rare, I find. It's really sometimes, you know, they happen and you start to feel it, and you start to feel the importance of it. And in hindsight, you know, they become even more important. But no, going into it, I wasn't, I mean, the whole thing happened so spontaneously. So I wasn't really prepared for negotiating. So it was in the moment that I decided to insist a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and reminds me of what Aparna was saying about these sort of little negotiations that are happening, and we never know in advance which ones are going to end up mattering. So that's really nice. Thank you. I should also mention Johannes is an alumnus of the FENS Kavli network, and our next speaker is Laura Andre from King's College London, and she's also a member of the FENS Kavli network. So Laura, could you tell us what your strategies are to make sure that you are prepared to follow through with negotiations?
Thanks very much, Megan, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here. Sadly, only virtually, but you know, it's definitely better than not happening. So what I really wanted to talk about was that for me, the really important thing, and this may sound sort of pretty basic, was simply to realize that you can negotiate in the first place. And I speak about this from the perspective of someone who's not maybe a natural negotiator. I think perhaps unlike Johannes, he clearly just has that kind of killer instinct. You know, when the moment comes, you know, instinct kicks in and he runs after the you know, the Nobel Prize winner. And I am definitely not like that. So so for those of you out there who maybe relate to finding this a bit harder and maybe instinctively tend to be a bit shyer and a bit, you know, more nervous about that, I thought I'd just talk about what for me was really important. Because what I tend to do, and I think I'm particularly bad maybe because I'm British, and so, you know, we like to kind of, you know, if we see a few people standing around, we instinctively join the end of the queue because, you know, that's our kind of natural instinct. And I'm female, and maybe that makes a difference as well. But anyway, I tend to accept whatever is first presented. You know, if I go into a shop and I ask the price, then I panic if I have to even think about negotiating. But it was kind of a revelation for me when the penny finally dropped that many things are negotiable. And that applies to a whole range of things, whether it's your startup package when you're trying to negotiate your first PI position, or the cost of a piece of equipment when you're trying to kit out your lab. And I confess that I've definitely had some spectacular failures. So when I was offered my PI position, I have to say I was so incredibly delighted and pathetically grateful that I pretty much said yes please, and that's obviously not a great negotiating strategy. So I don't recommend that. But having said that, I think that and I really relate to what Megan says about how you see yourself, and can you do you really deserve to ask for these extra things. But I have to say that I think that needing something or / maybe desperation is a very good driver for negotiation. And even if it doesn't come naturally, sometimes that can be the time when you really kind of push yourself to do it. And there was quite a good example when I was sort of setting up my lab and I didn't have very much money, probably because I'd failed to negotiate the first time round very well. And so I was trying to build a rig on not very much. And I realized that actually every single piece of equipment you could negotiate. And if you just gave that little pushback, people were often quite willing to move a bit. So I think that was quite an important moment for me. And actually, when I moved jobs as a postdoc, I did actually successfully negotiate a pay rise. So I think for me that initial pushback is quite clear. It's quite important. And then I think once you get into the negotiation situation, I think we probably all agree that one of the most important things is to be very clear on what exactly it is you want to get out of it. And also what your bottom line is, what would be a kind of deal breaker for you. It's quite good to kind of have that clear in your mind. But it's also very important to be constructive. So, to avoid being overly aggressive, I think, because, no one really at the end of the day wants to hire someone or work with someone or deal with someone who's like, who's overly aggressive. So I think you've got to be yourself. But also, and I think this speaks to something that Aparna was saying, which is maybe I would phrase it slightly differently, which is to try and see things from everyone's perspective. So even if you can't see an obvious win-win, which is obviously an ideal situation, but nevertheless, if you want more, that's going to be less for someone else. I mean, that can be an inevitable situation. But if you can imagine what their drivers would be and what it is that, what's the bottom line of the people you're negotiating with, I think you can more easily come to a kind of mutually agreeable solution. And then the other thing is to get as much information as you can. And I think we're going to hear this a lot, but perhaps one angle on that is that you can use the initial stages of negotiation as a kind of fact-finding mission as well. So you can often get clues as to what the other side's priorities might be, what their bottom lines might be, and that can help you in your negotiation. And then, of course, I think it's also quite useful, if you can, to have a plan B, or at least suggest that you might have a plan B, because that definitely strengthens your negotiation position and can make you feel, a bit more kind of confident about it. Last of all, I think it's important to be, to be pleasant. This is being recorded, so I'm just going to say nice, but I think, it's very, we all know people who can maybe be sort of not so pleasant in their negotiation style, and I think that's sort of unhelpful. And just to throw out a controversial point before I finish, which is that, I kind of wonder whether maybe, one day, obviously negotiation is always going to be important, but maybe, it won't be as critical as it is now, because, when new PIs are appointed, the, hiring departments will have faith in them and they will be offered the most that the organization can afford to help them succeed. And people, promotions will be suggested to those who deserve them, rather than having to fight tooth and nail for, every step of the way. Anyway, so that's what I had to say.
Thanks, Laura. I think we can certainly hope that that's the future. On the other hand, I do think that your example of negotiating for building your rig really shows that flexibility and keeping in mind that one can negotiate on different sides of a situation is also really a good thing to keep in mind.
And now it is my great pleasure to introduce former FENS president, She's a professor at University Medical Center Utrecht at Utrecht University, the Netherlands, and she's also professor, dean, member of the board of the University Medical Center in Groningen. And she's also member of Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences and Arts, to name just a few of her positions. And I already mentioned that she is a former FENS president. So Marianne, with all your impressive experience, can you please share with us your views on successful negotiations? And can you tell us if there is a secret how to end up with win-win solution, or at least with good compromise?
Okay, thank you, Zelka. Maybe there is a secret, but I haven't figured it out yet. So like Laura, I don't think I'm a natural negotiator. So I'm by nature a rather shy person, and I'm relatively small. So when I walk into the room, it's not like people look at me and think, well, this is the boss. So my asset is that I'm well prepared. And it comes back also a little bit to what Aparna said and what Menno is going to say. And I would like to make 2 points and illustrate them by examples. So one was sort of tangentially also mentioned by others, that of course you need to have a plan yourself, but you also need to prepare what the other party's point of view is. So I want to illustrate that by an example from my FENS days. So FENS has many, many valued partners who sponsor FENS, and thank you, partners, that you do that. But we got a heads up that one of these partners wanted to pull out, and they sponsored events that were really important for FENS. So instead of laying back and thinking, well, let's wait for the letter telling us that they are going to pull out, instead we visited them, and I started by saying how important their contribution was and how really important that event was for the young FENS members, and that we really relied on them, and whether they could maybe give us advice how to improve the relationship. So that sort of deflated their message that they were going to pull out, and it put them in a different position. Now they were going to be our advisor instead of our enemy. And it worked out really well. They confessed that they were going to pull out, but that now that really they wanted to think with us how they could improve the collaboration with FENS. And in the end, they did. And they actually raised their contribution. So, of course, that heads up was really important. Other people telling us, watch this, but also acting on it, not waiting for it, and be prepared and think, what is the position of the other and how can I bridge that gap? So that's one example from FENS reality. And the other was also brought up by a couple of people. Negotiation became really very hard when it's about yourself. So when you have to negotiate about your own career, the next career step, your salary, your starting package, etc. And very many people, if they get denied what they want, they take that personally. And that puts you in a very disadvantageous position because you become emotionally involved, whereas you should be more detached instead. So it helps actually to prepare that with maybe a professional coach or other peers, but to rehearse that session several times so that you don't have to look for arguments, but you have been training those arguments already in a sort of detached manner. And the example I'm going to give was about my own one of the career steps I was aiming for, and I thought I deserved it. And then I was sitting, I vividly remember that, I was sitting in a restaurant with my 2 supervisors who didn't want to give me that next step. And I thought it was totally unfair. So instead of giving the arguments, I was fighting my tears. I was so angry. I didn't know what to say. So if I had prepared that better, I could have gone to that argument more rationally, and it would have been a more pleasant event. And now I look back on that as a learning experience, how I shouldn't do it next time. Well, I don't have to do it again, but it really taught me a lesson that I didn't have space in my head at that time to have a rational discussion. Instead, I was just too angry, too emotionally involved, and avoid that. So it's more or less what Aparna was saying. Don't bring that former negotiation into your present situation. Try to be a little bit detached and more rational, because it's not helping you to take it too personally. So those are my two take-home messages.
Great, thank you so much. So basically, you mentioned something that is very important, because we also learn, we need to learn what mistakes we should avoid during negotiations. So you already mentioned one important mistake is be well prepared and don't get emotional, right?
Yeah, I think in general, mistakes are not seen as something to be avoided. It's something you grow from. I always take the parallel with how big sportsmen and sportswomen actually train. They hurt their muscles a little bit, and that's why the muscles get better. That's how mistakes in life are, you know. You have to learn from it and not see it as something negative.
Great, now I feel better for my mistakes that I have done in my life. Thank you. Megan?
Yeah, thanks. So our next panelist is Menno Witter. Menno is a professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and he also has had a lot of involvement with FENS and particularly with training programs. So he was chair of the CHET committee and also is the director of the Norwegian Research School in Neuroscience. So hopefully Menno can share some of his insights with us now. So Menno, how would you say, what do you think is most important when you're preparing for a negotiation? Menno, could you unmute your microphone, please?
Okay, there we go. So thank you very much, Megan, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I would also like to emphasize that I'm a member of ALBA, and therefore I think that this is a great event together with the FENS network, which is a very important structure within the community of FENS. So it has been said already, both by Aparna and Marianne and Laura also mentioned it, that I think a real important issue is to prepare for negotiation. And it could be like be prepared emotionally. It also means that you have to be prepared on what it is you want to negotiate for. And Laura mentioned it also, like if you negotiate for a rig, you have to take the perspectives into account. But I think what I noticed also being on the other side, so talking to people who are trying to negotiate themselves into a position, that people tend to forget about things that are really important. And I'll give you one example from my own experience. At some point I was negotiating about a position and I moved, at least that was the plan, from one university to the next one. So I had this round of discussions and I simply assumed that in this new place that the rules were the same as the place that I was working in. So I didn't negotiate, for example, about what are the costs for animal care? What does it take to breed animals? I knew that I had to buy animals, but as soon as I had them, I could just keep them, and there were animal caretakers, there was a vet. And then it suddenly turned out that I had to pay for all that. So my initial plan of negotiating for lab consumables failed completely. And on top of that, I also completely ignored or forgot to negotiate overhead costs, which at some universities can go up for 40, 50%. So that doubles suddenly your running cost. So my piece of advice is if you start negotiating for a position and you're working currently in a lab as a postdoc or as your first position, you want to make your next step, make a list of everything you do during the day. I touch gloves, I touch stuff, I need animals, I need a technician who can do this, and write it down. because it's very easy to forget these kind of things. And I think the second thing that I've also learned myself, being on both sides, is that it is important not only to be prepared, but also to be very honest. So make sure that you tell people what it is you really find important. And as a partner said, what is important on the short term now? If I would get started, what do I need now? And what do I need in the long run? And to give you one example that really happened, at some point we were negotiating with a person to join the center. And we thought we were very close to having a deal. And then a person sent an email, oh, by the way, I also need to know this, and I need this. And I said, okay, well, we can talk about that. Mm-hmm. And then a week later, we got the second email, like, oh, by the way, I also want this. And that continued to the point that we decided not to continue the negotiations with that person, because we got the impression that we're not sure that this person actually knows what is needed, what, in this case, he really needs for his lab to be up and running. So even if you're not entirely sure what it is you want, at least try to tell people that there are things that you're absolutely sure about and things that you need to know. And I think Laura mentioned it, that a negotiation, you might use that in the beginning to explore your future environment a little bit. So what are the limits of that environment and what are the things you need to know? And the final thing that I would like to say is that also be clear about your expectations. Quite often, if people negotiate for, let's say, your first PI position, they're negotiating in the context of a tenure track position, so there will be evaluation moments. And the worst case scenario is that you, as a young member in a center, will be surprised that people will expect you to deliver things. Like, you're supposed to teach. Then I think it's good advice to ask, great, how much? Do I teach 5 lectures in the semester? Do I teach 200 hours in the semester? That's a huge difference. And if that's going to be part of your evaluation and you do not fulfill that requirement, you probably didn't do yourself service by not asking about that and make things explicit. So I think my take-home message is that prepare, make sure that you know what it is you want, but of course, keep in mind that there are limits in a situation, and then try to find your way and find a balance between what it is you need to get out of it, what is the absolute minimum, and where can you take give something away to your negotiating partners. I think that's my piece of advice.
Thanks, Menno. That's fantastic. I've been taking notes, and I particularly like the way you put that you need to identify what you need and what you need to know, because I think you're absolutely right, particularly when moving into a new environment, that things are so different, that some things you just need to know how to work with. And I think your example of the animal costs and the overheads also really points out that sometimes there can be aspects of the negotiation that are more flexible than you thought from the beginning. And so even if you were focused on, how much budget you were going to have, you can actually make a bigger difference by just saying, okay, well, if I didn't need that money, but you gave me extra cages, would I be okay? And often that will be more successful. And I think was it Marianne who pointed out knowing how things work is a really important aspect of that, knowing what you're up against. Okay, great. So I wanted to point out that people can ask questions. I believe you have a chat window there where you can ask questions, because now we'll move to a Q&A with all of the panelists. And so we have one question so far that's already come in, but so please type away right now so we can keep the discussion going, because we still have some time. So the question we have, and I think, Laura, you sort of hit on this point directly, but it's relevant for many of us. And the point is a good one, that there's a known gender component to how behaviors are perceived, particularly in the context of negotiations. So a woman coming in and asking for something, there might be a different line of when that person is being perceived as either assertive or has crossed the line into being aggressive. And so the question is, so this can also influence, of course, whether people dare to engage in the negotiation in the first place. So the question is, what are the thoughts and advice to get around this issue, or how to deal with it, I guess, particularly for our female panelists? Laura, did you want to?
Well, so I guess, I think this, obviously this is a very real issue. And I'm very sympathetic to it. I think that probably, it's difficult to, give general advice, but I think my advice would be to frankly not worry too much about it. I think if you're female and I think you just have to assume the best of the people who you're negotiating with, and probably, if you're, for example, negotiating for a job, then if they take that view of you because you're choosing to negotiate, maybe this isn't a place that you want to go and work. Maybe these are not your future colleagues. I think there is also an element whereby, we all know what a kind of constructive, positive negotiation should be and can be. And actually what I think my instinct is what it really is that sometimes men get away with a very aggressive negotiation stance, and that women don't, which is obviously not fair. But really, I don't think anyone should be negotiating that aggressively. I think we can all be constructive and positive and nice to each other. But that definitely shouldn't be a reason not to negotiate.
Can I add something to that? I think there is a lot of implicit bias still around. And just to give an example of myself, that I do have that implicit bias. So we had a departmental head who was negotiating about a salary, a woman, and she was actually asking a lot. And I noticed in myself that I found that very sort of surprising. A woman negotiating about her salary. So even though I'm aware of it, I have a very strong implicit bias. And I can only hope that time will change that. And for the time being, we just have to live with it. People expect us to behave in a certain way, and it will be interpreted in that way. Well, I have to live with it. Don't get too distracted by it. Just be authentic and negotiate in a way that fits with your personality.
Thank you.
I think Aparna wanted to. Sorry.
If I could add a point to this, this is something that I have no citation for because I did not see the original study, but I actually saw a TED Talk which talked about this, and I thought it was very interesting. And they split down this gender divide about expectations from men versus women or from different genders about how they negotiate. And they found that it was context specific. So if it was in a context where a negotiation, broadly defined, was expected, then there was no the ones who identified as female were not penalized for negotiating quite aggressively. And the specific context they looked at was law. So they looked at lawyers and they looked at law schools. So that's an environment in which they expected women to really negotiate as much as men, and there was no difference in the perceived aggression or in the perception of either of the genders. So perhaps all of science needs to move to the point where we don't perceive any difference in negotiation. We might perceive, as several people have raised, the point that people who are too aggressive out of context as being too aggressive irrespective of their gender versus not. And we need to perhaps get to that point where this is acceptable.
Yeah, that's it. That's a great point. I would add maybe one more thing here, which is I think this is partly where the importance of being really honest about what you want and authentic about how you express it can be really important. And I definitely do think that it's taken me sort of years to learn how to negotiate, but also how to be assertive without being aggressive. And I've crossed various lines at various stages of my career, I think, where I have been sort of overly aggressive. And I do think different strategies work for me as a woman than what I see working for my male colleagues. And it has taken me time to learn that, and you know, for better or for worse. Johannes, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can add something to this from a male perspective. I think, I mean, also what Marion said, there's this implicit bias out there, and we have to live with it. But I think for future generations, I mean, starting with, you know, this discussion and with our generation already, we should train future generations to overcome this bias kind of thing. And so, for instance, I have 2 kids, one girl, one boy, and I see this. So it's not an implicit bias, or it's just the behavior of them is so different. Although we tend to, you know, or we think we educate them the same way, but my daughter is much more shy than my son is. And so I try to encourage this, you know, just, you know, go and ask for this by yourself, etc. Something that my son would do just like this, without hesitance and without hesitation, and my daughter wouldn't. And so I think also, I mean, with kids, so you should be starting this very early. And then later on, you know, with undergrad students, etc., you know, stand up for something that you really want. And I think all of us, we should encourage this type of behavior.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a couple more questions coming in. Maybe we have 2 that are sort of related. One is about how to negotiate if you are trying to get an academic position and you also want to secure a position for your partner. So the famous 2-body problem. And a related question on how to negotiate a position considering family, particularly when a new job might involve relocation to a new area. So do any of our panelists like to speak to that? I've been through the 2-body problem myself, but I'd let someone else speak. Menno?
Yeah, I think it's a very common problem, and it's becoming more and more common. And I think it's important when you start negotiating to bring that up right away, that your partners know that there is the 2-body problem to think of. In my experience, it's becoming more and more common that at least major employers are aware of this issue. It's not that common yet, I think, that they will deal with it in a very efficient way. So your negotiating partners might be sympathetic to the issue and will likely try to help you, particularly if you're a candidate that they really would like to recruit. But I don't think that it's a really easy issue to solve currently. In many countries, there's all kinds of regulations where it's very difficult to influence. So I really think it's something that you need to explore in a very open way and see what the possibilities are. But it's not easy, that's for sure.
Thank you. Many questions are coming in. I see one very briefly. Early in your career, how do you identify what is reasonable to negotiate? Maybe Aparna?
Sure. I feel that early in your career, it's really the time when you need to ask other people. It's very helpful to get advice from colleagues and from people who've been through the same thing. This is kind of the third point I raised. Often when you're early in your career, you don't know what the parameters are. You don't know what are the things you should negotiate. And it perhaps speaks to the point that was raised earlier about women being less likely to negotiate in some contexts. And it helps a lot to know exactly what is up for grabs. This speaks to both Marion's and Menno's point about knowing it, but in addition to knowing it, getting the advice of other people. This is super helpful in knowing what you can do. I found it, just as an example, when I was on the job market, I really actually found it extremely helpful that I had discussions with my postdoc advisor, who was like, oh, by the way, don't forget about, actually, she raised the marks point. And, you know, some universities do this, think about that. And, oh, do you know some universities would consider renovations should come out of your startup? Have you thought about that? And I perhaps would not even have considered it. So when you're early in your career, that's extremely helpful to get that kind of input. And it doesn't necessarily need to be an advisor. It could be one of your contemporaries who just did the whole thing a year ago or 2 years ago. And there's so many people who are willing to help. Everyone is extremely collegial in general. So tap into that resource. It's extremely helpful.
Great, thank you. So the questions are coming in fast and furious right now. We won't be able to get to all of them. But one of them popped out, and this was something we discussed earlier, which is, if at first a negotiation fails or doesn't end up in a positive outcome, like the example that Marianne gave, how do you know when to try again, or how hard to push, or when to stop? Menno also gave the example of somebody that maybe went too far. So Marianne, I don't know, do you have any advice on how to gauge that level of when to stop?
Yeah, well, like in the example of Menno, I think that, that chance was over. But in my own case, I've had discussions with people that I was really unhappy about afterwards. And then I would actually send this person an email some days later and say, and explain that I was really unhappy about it. And could we have another try? And usually people give you a second chance. And it also helps to see what the impact was of how they behaved on you. And that's what I'm coming back to the point of honesty and being authentic. So I thought I would like to share what the impact was of what these people did to me. And then you don't have to do it immediately, but let's say 3 months later, you say, okay, let's forget about this discussion. Let's start again. And usually that works out well. Sometimes it doesn't, but then you have to agree to disagree. But sharing the impact of that particular situation with the person you negotiate with sometimes helps. It really depends on the situation. But in this kind of personal thing, it usually helps.
And then maybe a quick follow-up. Do you think it's ever useful to sort of escalate in the chain of command?
Is that to me again?
Yeah, well, I guess since we were discussing it earlier, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you should be really careful with that if you jump one level, because the person you jump that level is going to be pissed. And more likely than not, the person you're going to, so let's say one level up, is going to push it back. Say, this is something you have to solve with your supervisor directly. And then you're in a really bad situation because you already passed that supervisor and you're pushed back, so you have to negotiate in the end as well. So try to solve it at that level and be really careful to go one level up.
Thank you, great. There are so many interesting questions. Let me ask you all if you feel that you are discriminated against during a negotiation, what should you do? Very briefly, please. Who wants to say something? Menno, please.
So I think it's a very difficult issue and a very difficult question to address. I think if you feel that you're discriminated for whatever reason, there's multiple reasons. We talked already a little bit about gender. There's the whole width and spectrum of gender issues. There was a question about that as well. I think that you should try to bring that up during the negotiation, or as Marianne suggested, maybe you can get back to it and say that you were really unhappy by the way you were treated by people in a negotiation issue or a negotiation setting. And if it's really becoming an issue, I think that I would follow Laura's advice. That, is this the place where you want to work? Because if that comes up during a negotiation, it's probably something that is embedded or ingrained in the organization. Like in my university, we now always have a non-involved person at the interviews or at the negotiations in particular. And the role of that person is only to watch whether anybody in the negotiating panel is making remarks or suggestions or even body language hints that would dismiss a person for whatever discriminative reason. But it actually works the other way around as well. So if the person who is negotiating to get a position starts to become, in a way, discriminative towards the other side of the party that is negotiating, that person will also make a remark. So I think you could ask for that, and it's becoming more and more common in universities to do this. But I would definitely seriously consider whether this is the place you want to end up.
Thank you, Menno. I see one question, again, very briefly. If you had a bad time with your ex-supervisor, how do you bring it to the current negotiation? I think that Aparna mentioned something like that, not to bring previous experience. Forget about previous experience, please. Brief
Absolutely.
Advice.
This is one of those cases where the advice is easier to give. It's easier said than done. I definitely see how hard it is to let go of that emotion, of the bad experience you've had, and learn from it. And that distance there is no correct answer to this. It's going to be extremely difficult to do, but recognizing it is perhaps the first step towards trying to deal with it or trying to leave that emotion behind. As Marian mentioned, sometimes you just need time. When you step away from it, you saw, okay, that was a situation in which, had I not had the added emotional component, I might have been a more effective negotiator. So perhaps having that knowledge ahead of time gives you that little bonus that you need, that I should watch out. I have an emotional component here. But I also recognize that this is something that every individual is going to have to deal with, perhaps in a different way, because the way we internalize those emotions and the way we carry it on is also different. I would just suggest that have that recognition, that awareness, having a plan, as several people have brought up, really helps with it, because you can bring it down to the rational and the concrete rather than having just the purely emotional aspect at the table. But having said all that, this is a hard one. This is one where there are no complete correct answers.
Thank you so much, Aparna. There are so many interesting questions. Megan, please pick one that you like the best.
Well, actually, I'm seeing one that I'm really getting mad about.
Okay.
I see here how to negotiate for starting a family, having a child. Many supervisors still do not support it, for example, during PhD, and I was even openly told don't do it. I find this heartbreaking. I mean, we have still a lot of work to do to learn supervisors not to say that, because if intelligent women don't breed, the IQ of the general population is going down. They should be supported. So this is something that's going beyond negotiating. You should not have to negotiate about it. It's something we really have a mission about, also as ALBA, to let supervisors see that a happy PhD student or postdoc is really important to have in the lab. And if happy means having a family, that's something you have to accommodate and find a solution for. So I really want to make that statement, because I don't think it's something we should have to negotiate.
I think that's very important. And I think recognizing that there are sort of basic rights that one should not have to negotiate for is also a very important point that touches on something that Laura and Menno were discussing about how do you know whether you should actually be at the place that you're negotiating with if you're finding that you have to negotiate for totally unreasonable things, which this most clearly falls into that category. And I would just point out that, ultimately, you're the one with the power in this situation in some ways, right? You can leave a bad situation. So it isn't an answer to negotiation, but is a way, if you're prepared to do it, that you can have quite a lot of leverage in a negotiation situation. And in that case, I would, clearly leaving may be a strong option.
We have just time for one question.
Okay, no, well then I'll stop.
Please pick up one question, the last question, because we have 1 more minute.
Well, okay, there was one here I thought was interesting because I've seen it happen successfully and unsuccessfully. How do people feel about playing 2 offers off of each other? I think this is particularly at the starting a faculty position stage.
Be honest about it. I think if you try to play people against each other, at some point people will find out and they'll hate you for it. So just tell that you are trying to deal with different positions and you want to get the best out of it. And that's the point I wanted to make also. Remember that if you're invited for a negotiation, there's something that you have that your potential future employer does not have, which is you. And so if I'm trying to employ you and therefore we're in negotiation, you have power because I'm interested in you as your employer. So I think you don't ever forget that and use it. And so I think it's fair that you talk to multiple employers, but be honest about it.
That's fantastic. I think that's a perfect place to end, don't you, Zelka? Okay.
Yes, I agree.
So we just wanted to point out that there are some links with more information on this topic if you're interested, and also some links where you can find out more about the FENS Kavli network and the ALBA network who were hosting today's presentation. So hopefully I'm sharing my screen with you now where you can see some of the links that you can access for more information. And thank you very much to all of our panelists for a really interesting and hopefully informative discussion today.
Yes, I want to thank you all for participation. I'm sure you agree that we heard some very inspiring stories, and I hope you learned some tips that can be modified and you can use it in the future. And if I can summarize our discussion, it would be: do your homework, be well prepared for negotiation, know exactly what you want, have a plan, be honest, depersonalize, and don't be afraid to negotiate. It is a skill that can be learned. And thank you and good luck with your negotiation.